Yeah, hi everyone, and welcome to the panel. I'm Ginny Bartlett. I've been in the privacy space, oh my gosh, since about the late 1980s, mostly in-house, and watched the development of emerging technologies and how privacy applies to the space. Since that time, it used to be just a privacy policy that went up on a screen on a website, and that was all you really needed to do. And then the FTC started enforcing, and then we went into outsourcing and cloud infrastructures and apps. And as the digital environment has evolved, so has privacy. And we're kind of here today to talk about one of those digital advancements. Earlier today, we talked about some of the dark patterns and how technology is used there, and what privacy enhancing technologies might be helpful in dark patterns. We also talked about the brain interfaces and the things you can do with that, and some of the privacy enhancing operational controls you can add to that. So we're here today on this panel to explore another emerging technology in the digital health space, vaccine passports, with proponents seeing it as a way to safely enable us back into this normal life, if there's such a thing, in this post-COVID world. And whether that is in the context of return to work, going to sports events, or traveling across straight lines or country lines, there's this concept that now that I have my vaccine, if I can prove it, then we can safely return to other activities. One thing is clear from the developments on vaccine passports in this last month in particular. It's become an opinion out there is divided on its use. Technologies can be out there for broad use or narrow use. For example is the EU Green Pass, which has intended broad use, or you look at a narrow use like the New York State Excelsior Pass. And there is public concern about privacy that's starting to be expressed. Transparency on how all of these things are starting to work, and the use of the passport information, how much of my health data is being shared. There's not a whole lot of transparency around that yet. And so one of the purposes of this panel is to try to surface some of the technologies, some of the concerns about the technologies, but also some of the privacy enhancing features that a CPO might want to know about if they're considering using a passport in their own workforce or for their own company. So I'm going to turn it over to our panelists. We're very fortunate today to have a range of experts, some of whom are working in-house and considering all of the legal implications for their own companies, or maybe even for their clients, or are working with clients to try to enable their perspectives. And the others are developing apps and solutions. So we're very fortunate to have this broad range of perspective to help CPOs understand the lay of the land. So I'm going to turn it over to the panelists to introduce themselves and tell us a little bit about their work in space. So maybe start with Scott. Scott, you're muted.
Too many screens going. Thank you. Hi, everybody. Thanks, Ginny. Good to be here. This is Scott. My name is Scott Gallant. I have a significant background working predominantly in the education space of all places, working on building technology solutions, but found my way into the ethical use of information and health information protection, education information protection. And so I do call myself a privacy expert too, even amongst the folks that might be on this call and listening in. I've had the opportunity over the last year to be playing predominantly in this space of health emerging technologies. And one of them is this area of health vaccinations and whatnot. So looking forward to commenting and probably learning more than informing during this session.
So Maureen.
Thanks, Ginny. So Maureen Drywason, I'm Vice President, Group General Counsel and Global Privacy Officer at Allegis Group. So I actually kind of wear three distinct hats, each of which will influence my perspective on the panel today, and appreciate being asked to participate today, and really look forward, I think, as Scott said, from learning from all the fellow panelists about things that they're seeing in this space. As my title implies, I'm Group General Counsel. So for that, I am the lead attorney for ERISA and employee benefits. So everything related to our health plan and HIPAA issues falls into my area. I am general counsel of one of our operating companies, Major Lindsay in Africa, who those in the legal space may have heard of us, but we obviously do actual work. So I'm putting temporary attorneys to work and having to think about workspace issues in that role. And then I'm the global privacy officer for Allegis Group worldwide. So thinking about the privacy issues across all of our operating companies and how this issue of vaccine passports may impact us. So looking forward to the discussion today.
And Eric?
Thanks so much. Thrilled to be here today. Appreciate the invite from WireWheel. I'm Eric Bull, and I'm a partner in our data privacy practice at Deloitte. I lead data privacy for the life sciences and healthcare industry. I've been with Deloitte now for almost 19 years. Spend the majority of my days helping our clients design, implement, and operate their data privacy programs, and obviously that includes privacy enhancing technology, configuration and implementation as well. And obviously, given the environment we've been living in for the past year and a half, have had lots of conversations on this, vaccine and related topics over the past 14, 15 months. So thrilled to be here. Thanks for having me.
Eric, thanks everyone. As for the audience, I hope you can see we really have a group of experts, and I hope that you will participate by posting your questions and even in a chat answers, because as you can see, it's a new space and we're all kind of looking to learn. So please do queue up your questions, and I'll be looking out for them as the panel progresses. So I think probably it makes sense, since this is kind of a new area, everybody kind of has their own lens on it. If we start with the baseline, what is the lay of the land when it comes to vaccines? I'm a consumer, I have a vaccine certificate or not. Is the vaccine certificate the same thing as the vaccine passport? What are the different use cases for a certificate versus a passport? If I'm already enrolled in a contact tracing app, should I assume that they already have my vaccine certificate? So bring this world together for us in this last year. What are the different technologies that are out there, and what are different use cases for them? Who's using them? So maybe start with Scott.
Sure. And to zone right in on it, a vaccination passport, and the panelists had a moment to state a few words kind of while we were getting our backgrounds going and hoping we didn't come on to this session on mute like I did. So I apologize for that. But Eric made there were only a few words spoken, but Eric had a more poignant definition of a health pass. So I don't want to steal thunder from that, but I will start by sort of laying out a landscape with respect to the pandemic and our approach on controlling it as either officers within industry or leaders across the sector of technology and data standards, et cetera. And we started with numerous technologies that focused on location monitoring, indoor intelligence, tracking, quarantine management, symptoms management, and solutions of the like. And the question came as to whether those come top down from countries looking at border entry, and how much do I, as someone driving privacy for a company or driving safety for an organization, need to worry about onboarding those types of technologies for my audience of employees as well as visitors. And if you speak to specific sectors, we have certain audiences in certain sectors that have potentially even more risk for onboarding on some technologies like that, particularly in healthcare, of course. We have the senior facilities and senior care that were struck pretty hard by COVID. They have a degree of mobile staff that come in and out. There's family members and visitors that come in and out, patients, of course, and residents themselves, as well as employees. In the school or education space, we have a population that seasonally comes in and out and looking to do classes in person. We have staff, of course, there as well. And so your unique case in terms of what you're trying to target and control for may lend you to look at different aspects of COVID response technologies that are out there, some that may be new and opportunistic in the last year, and others that might be part of emergency response or health threat networks or solutions that have been on the scene for potentially decades. But one thing certain is that we've had to sort of reevaluate our footprint for data in onboarding these tools, and what does it mean to have something called a passport for a vaccination, or for the first 6 months of this, it was all about a test certification. And I think it'll come down to just two things for me as to what's the source and issuer of that information, and how far and prevalent can it be distributed, and for what purposes? Back to our Common Core privacy definitions. But we all have definitions for that, so I'll leave some of that thunder, as I mentioned, to Eric, because he had a very few words. He stated what a vaccination passport is.
Boy, Scott's really talking me up. I feel like there's a lot of pressure to deliver now and be really impressive. What I was simply saying was that I feel like there's been a lot of different tools and apps, rolled out over the course of going back to March of last year. And I think some of the terms have become a little synonymous, even though they're doing very different things. I think, as Scott was saying up front, we tended to have a lot of kind of health declarations and symptom trackers and things like that. And then from there, as people started to get back into the office, then we started to get into proximity trackers and, trying to pass, proximity data from one phone to another to try to, track potential exposures. And now we're truly getting into vaccine passports, which is a, some sort of electronic proof of vaccination. And so lots of different things out there. And I think we'll see them be used in a lot of different ways in the future. In terms of what I expect to see here shortly, Gallup actually did a poll recently showing that most people in the United States don't want to have to show a vaccine passport to go back to work or to go into a restaurant. They're willing to show it to travel or to attend like a large sporting event or a concert or something like that. But there's wide, public opinions. And unfortunately, the numbers are not like overwhelming either way. We're very divided on the issue. And so, what I think we might see is some sort of vaccine passport that evolves for, call it, travel purposes, international travel, things like that. But maybe for the environment that more of us are in, more of a business employment environment, we're going to see things that are more just health declarations and, symptom trackers and things like that. So I think it's if I had to guess what we're going to see, I would say it's probably going to be fragmented, but we'll see.
So Maureen, you want to give us a sense of what a vaccine passport or certification means to you, wearing your 3 hats? What does it look like to you?
So I think certainly what Eric described as more the certification world, I think that's what at least I'm seeing so far. We're not seeing too much. We're certainly, for us as a company, we are not requiring that anybody prove vaccination status. Now, you had places like Santa Clara County in California that got us all worked up for a short time before they changed it again. So employers are rapidly trying to figure out, here's where I can't do this, here's where I have to do this, here's where I might want to do this, which if you're a multi-state employer, can be really convoluted. And when you're trying to create a patchwork, that is always hard to implement. You're trying to do what you think is fair to all employees, recognizing that you can't do the same thing for all employees because Oregon wants you to do one thing and Montana's over here telling you not to do anything. And in fact, you are prohibited from doing anything. So it always makes me think of, drafting data breach notification letters. You can't draft one because Massachusetts wants you to tell nothing about what happened and everybody else wants you to tell everything about what happened. There is no such thing as one letter or the lowest common denominator. So this idea that we can go to the strictest standard, the lowest common denominator, what is that? There is no such thing when in fact what you have are mutually exclusive things that can't happen at the same time. So it makes it really complicated. I think what we've done, we both have our own internal employees thinking about people that work for Allegis Group and its operating companies, and then our temporary employees that we place at client sites. So when you get into that explodes the world even more to every employer and what they might be doing. And we place people in healthcare, and we place people in manufacturing sites, and then we place people in more traditional office settings. And each of those different client bases are having different reactions to what's happening. So we not only have to think about it for ourselves, we have to make sure that we're sending our contract employees into a space that we understand what the requirements are, that we've prepared them for that as we go look to recruit for the talent for that particular profile, for whatever it is that client needs, that we understand what the workplace is going to be like, because that person's got to know you're going to have to present perhaps proof of vaccination status. So that's an additional element in recruiting for the job that you've now got to deal with that we've honestly never really had to deal with before, right? You might have had a fitness for duty and you lift. Are you able to work around the following chemicals? Like this has now been added to that sort of OSHA list in a way to think about where people are willing to work. And then it requires a lot of communication between us and our clients to make sure that we understand what their posture is. Are they using an app? Are they using technology? If so, how is that data being handled? Are they expecting us to collect that data and then share it with them, making it even more complicated if we weren't otherwise going to require it for ourselves? So those are the kinds of things that I think we're starting to see. And again, I would say it is all across the board. We definitely have some clients that are starting to request that we have it. We actually had some employees that were in the hospital that was in Texas. That was the subject of the recent lawsuit. In which there was a fight about all of that. So it'll be very interesting to watch this all unfold. But I think as an employer, we're doing our best, the best that we can to sort of strike the happy medium of trying to balance the privacy interests of our employees, the requirements of many of our clients, trying to operate a safe working environment, and then trying to comply with a patchwork of laws all at the same time. Between a rock and a hard place is the best way to explain where we live. You're sort of in trouble if you go one direction, maybe in trouble with another, but we're doing the best that we can to balance it all out. I think what'll be interesting for us, I think the two biggest things I'll be interested to watch is as various places get closer to herd immunity, will they change dramatically what they choose to do? And Pfizer getting out of emergency use status. I heard a buzz that perhaps they will do that over the summer. And so therefore, will the law take a different stance on requiring people to be vaccinated when it's no longer under emergency use, but is in fact a regular vaccine? And will that start to see change, people requiring it more than we're seeing right now?
Awesome. Great lay of the land. Sounds a little bit like the Wild West, but I think we're kind of used to that in privacy. Lots of different factors to be considering and on a case-by-case basis. So maybe it makes sense to help folks on the call understand what is the lay of the land when it comes to technology? What are the different kinds of solutions that are out there? Whether you're seeing them at your clients or what do we know about them? So we know from the discussion during health notification apps that there was one model of a centralized database and another model under more like a blockchain where there's a public or private network. What are the models that are out there and what does a CPO need to know about that? And I'll kind of turn that over for a starting point to Scott and Eric. You guys decide who wants to take that first.
Sure, I'll jump in. You hit it. There's these concepts of distributed networking, and we might commonly reference those philosophies as blockchain, but to extend the definition of that, really it comes down to a network that might back a certification. I mentioned that the term issuer. If you have a certification of a vaccination or test or anything else, that credential in its own right only has merit based on the issuer. So where did it come from? So one camp, if you will, is to take a look at the issuers and understand what's happening in networking of trust on that end, because not only does it define or help us define standards around data, standards around the technology, potentially bring and lower the cost of acquisition of those down, but also can build trust with the consumer base out there, with travelers, with citizens. The other side of it, and the focus, Eric, that I was pinning on you there was the concept of a health declaration, whereby some organizations may simply be requesting proof of a vaccination by showcase of a document, your CDC card here in the US, for example. And they may register that, they may not register at all. They may register it as a checkbox on an Excel sheet somewhere. They may choose to or desire to take photos and store that as part of a record, right? And so there is sort of this gamut of understanding the differences in terms of the applications themselves when it comes to what people are referencing as a passport and unpacking that to the different types of solutions that are out there. When it comes to the network side of it, the Clear, for example, speaking about travel, Clear is rolling out with theirs. There's Green Pass, Common Pass, Verify, Dayon. There's hundreds of solutions now that are in this space, if not thousands. And keeping up with it has been somewhat of a challenge. My intent a year ago, because I do also wear a hat as a VP of trust for an organization doing distributed networking of verified credentials, a credential that represents your vaccinations fits perfectly into our space where we're already in healthcare doing work in clinical trials in other areas. And just trying to unpack the partners and who they are currently playing with was such a challenge. And so I think rather than trying to label off a laundry list of providers, I'd say try to recognize the different categories of providers that are out there that are doing this right now. And some, like myself, are focused really on the consultancy of recognizing what might be a best approach for an organization and kind of lending them into the right path. As Maureen focused a little bit on the regulatory and the legal landscape of this, it's something to be considerate of as well. Where we're currently still considering this an emergency, it may be that at a top-down approach for regulators, we are in this sort of emergency use of information whereby some of our rights when it comes to privacy may be a little lacking, but think about this 6 months, a year from now. Are we setting a tone for a new standard? Or is this something that maybe will roll off and we just want these technologies there to onboard if ever we're in a similar situation? We can go on for hours, but I'm not going to take more than another second to just say next and try to push it over to Eric and or Maureen.
Yeah. Jenny, maybe I'll just touch on the second part of what you said, which is, what should privacy officers or privacy professionals be thinking about? And I have found that while the technology is fascinating, as Scott clearly pointed out, in most of organizations I'm working with, the privacy team isn't actually involved in like the selection of the app or the process itself, but what they are involved in is kind of having a seat at the table and making sure that privacy considerations are taken into account. And so what I would say to privacy officers and their teams is, make sure you have that seat at the table. Make sure you've thought about like, how are you executing a privacy impact assessment or some similar sort of privacy assessment, third-party assessment on that app, working with the CISO's team to make sure that they're doing some sort of security assessment, getting third-party assurance if you can, and thinking about all those different aspects that you would typically think through, from a privacy impact assessment standpoint, right? Thinking about, how you're going to address notice and consent and data subject rights, and, how are you going to address data retention when hopefully we get to the end of all this, thinking through all those different things that we typically think through from a privacy by design standpoint. I think that's the most important thing that our privacy professionals should think about right now, and making sure they have that seat at the table and that they're at least involved and informed in the decision.
So maybe Eric, following up on that, are there, if you think about the different solutions that are out there and the types of data that are collected, stored, shared, and fit into that bucket of, thinking about how I'm storing this, all the different privacy principles, including data minimization, how do the different solutions the QR code where you actually upload your credential versus the distributed model where you're actually sharing a check mark, yes, no, I've had a vaccine. How are the different models working? And, from a privacy perspective, and the privacy principles perspective.
Yeah, I think Scott's probably the better one to answer it from kind of a front of a technologist standpoint. And I think, a lot of privacy officers are more legal and compliance professionals and are probably letting their IT or security peers handle some of the technology questions, but to get to your point, I do think that's some of the things that privacy officers should be thinking about is, as they go through some of those assessments, particularly thinking about like access restrictions, data reuse. How do you make sure that the data that's being, collected for a vaccine passport or something similar isn't accessed for any other purpose, and obviously that things like data minimization are taken into consideration. But Scott, from a technologist standpoint, anything else you would add?
I think there's a couple of things as part of the selection too. You mentioned a great process of evaluating on the privacy side of it. And when it comes to third-party use, certainly there's some challenges in there right now with many of these solutions. Even though some of the passport solutions, if I happen to carry one and potentially my employer or for entry to an experience or something requires it, I show a QR code, for example, it's scanned. That scan may better build my identity for the rest of the network where it's used in some other organization. So it's the same purpose, just it's under a different controllership in terms of the relationship I have potentially with another another entity, another organization to travel or go back to work. So that's kind of one of the concerns. From a technologist standpoint, I think there's a lot of techies out there that have been biting at the bit to apply blockchain-oriented solutions for years and come up with a great set of use cases that people can rally around. So from that perspective, I think we're seeing some amazing advancements in application. The challenge there comes in adoption, right? I may choose to accept for my large organization that might have multiple campuses across the US or global to get into bed with one of the vaccination passports. But in order for those people to all onboard, they're going to want to tap my HR registry or something like that to start everybody out. From the travel sector, the airlines are sort of the first line here, where they are actually requesting travelers to download and do some proof of vaccination. And some of them have a network whereby if you already have a pass from organization A, B, or C, they may accept that because there's a native trust that's been built in the fabric behind the scenes. Otherwise, they're collecting it fresh. Then when you land to a sovereign country, right now what's happening is those sovereign countries are being asked to accept the same passport. And of course, that's low friction for me, the traveler. Theoretically, the networking can be done in such a way that it is not causing for a ton more process and expense on the technology end. But it comes back to that concept of a trust framework and all the parties that are members thereof. And so as an organization, if you're looking at the technology and not thinking about the rest of that space around where else might this data be used, what if a new employee comes on board, they are going to have one of these passes that they can natively push into my environment. And thereafter, am I storing, as an employer or as a company, am I choosing to actually store any of this information to fulfill on the solution? Some of these solutions are completely cloud-based, and the traveler or the consumer at their own choice is electing to come in. They're electing to share that passport, and it's an organization's challenge to state whether that's required, in fact, for some experience.
Yeah, great. So Maureen, as someone who's sitting in-house and who gets involved in privacy impact assessments, do you have yet a checklist for COVID type health solutions? And what would be on that checklist if you're looking at a solution?
No, will be the short answer to that question. The longer answer to that question is we have other DPIA based off of GDPR and other things that I imagine we would use to fashion it. And honestly, it's thinking about all the things that everybody's just talked about. I mean, when I got asked to be on this panel, and I think I mentioned to some of the panelists that I noticed that Clear had the ability, as Scott said earlier, they have an app. So I had to go through the process because I was like, I wanted to see how theirs worked. And I just happened to travel from vacation. And so I decided to go through the health vaccination portion of the Clear app. So first you have to actually have it look at your face for, I guess, to match up your retina scan they have on file for you, which freaked me out initially as the starting point. I was like, okay, do I really want to keep going? But I was like, I'm going to do it. So I let it take a picture of me. And then it verified my identity. I was like, okay, that's one, frightening. But two, I seem to have passed the first phase. And then it asked me to take a picture of my vaccine card, which I then also did. And then I still had to enter manually all my information. And then I get a little QR code, as everybody was just talking about. But in the top left corner, it says pending verification. I was like, from who? I just said I was me. I just took a picture of the card and I just gave it to you. Are you calling the Baltimore Convention Center to make sure I was there? Like, who could you possibly consult with to verify this on me? So it is fascinating kind of just watching it in real life and being an individual who wants to get through society like anybody else and see what happens. I think in the employment context, and as we think about it, I think we would love to avoid capturing the data as much as possible to avoid doing the PIA or even having to fashion one. So I would love technology that, and we actually, even pre-pandemic, we're looking at technology that, to sort of Scott's idea, this idea that you kind of have your own data that you then choose to share with other people. It's stored in a blockchain type of format. But let's say I just want to have my own employment history so that you don't have to do employment verifications on me. And then the temporary employment, that's a big deal. We're constantly having to try to see if we can understand somebody's employment history. What if I could carry that around, already verified by the various issuers, right? Those people who employed me, confirming that, in fact, those are my dates of employment, that I did work there, that was my job title, etc. And then every time I want to move, somebody's just gaining access to that. And I know that it's far more complicated than I just explained it to be, but there's a part of our industry that would love for that to be the case, and sort of true on vaccines. So that if you do want to go work for a client that requires it, you're going to be able to then provide it. And as opposed to every client designing their own technology, the person sort of owns it, safeguards it, controls it, decides who has access to it. And that can be used for a variety of different use cases in our world, everything from credit checks and background checks to employment verification to other things that you could choose to store about yourself that you choose to decide when to share. So I think for me, at least, I'd love to see in our industry the ability for us to store less data about people and figure out ways for them to store it and control it. And to be able to make sure that we feel comfortable about how that happens. I think the complication gets in the data sharing and then how you really even think through all of that. But that could be a place that I would love to see sort of more thought given as to whether or not that's workable.
If I may, Maureen, I'll say that at the technical level, some of these concepts around distributed network are in fact the same technologies applied. And so if it didn't resonate with what Maureen said, particular to Maureen's question, there are some movements that the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, I'm involved in one that's really great, where what we do is, because of my nature and my history in education, we're looking at skills acquired through the acquisition of your diploma in high school and what competencies have you built at the lowest of levels in your schooling, whether that is formal professional development or early years. And those skills have some degree of control under and understand their relevancy and their adequacy for future use. And they can be automatically presented to Maureen and the team evaluating an HR hire, for example. An acquisition of skills or experiences on the job can then still further service that individual in doing something next life where they might go next. And so it's the same concept of moving some of this information on these technology blockchains that can assist and aid in health. And so we just kind of rallied really quick to try to put together a nice tight knit community on doing these vaccination verified credentials, are the term, the VCs, or verified credentials. And those that are interested in looking at more on the standards for verified credentials, I'd urge you check out the World Wide Web Consortia. We have the VC group or the COVID credentials group. There are numbers of groups that are focusing on the data standards for these movements.
Thanks, Scott. Eric, anything to add?
Maybe Maureen said something at the beginning that kind of I wanted to double click on a little in terms of like having, she mentioned leveraging a DPIA template. And I think, what's so important for all these organizations is that if you have a solid foundational privacy by design process that triggers, a privacy impact assessment, hopefully that process is built in such a way that it's flexible and adaptable enough to handle this or any other situation that pops up, whether it's customer personal information, employee personal information, whatever it is. I think that's really the goal of privacy by design, is not have to reinvent the wheel every time a new privacy issue or consultation pops up, that you can, have a process that's robust enough and flexible enough to handle all these different use cases or situations when they arise.
So we talked a little bit about the fact that we are in an emergency situation. And I was a CPO in New York City right after 9/11, where we went into a national security emergency situation. And the immediate response was, we need a centralized travel database so we can see who's coming in and out of our country, track the movement of people, especially if there are security risks, so kind of putting a flag on them. There's a parallel to what we're talking about. There's a national health emergency. We need to know who has we need to know who has the vaccine and who doesn't. So I guess the question I'd like the panel to explore is whether we think that the 9/11, post 9/11 experience, where there was actually a retrenchment afterwards, is something we should be learning from when it comes to the development of technology. And I would just, also say that I think it was 2 days ago, Jen Psaki, the press secretary for the White House, came out and said there will be no federal vaccinations database, no federal mandate requiring everyone to obtain a single vaccination credential. Where there are others who are responding to that, like the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health says the Biden administration should encourage vaccine passports for the simple reason that the standardization of the tracker is important for companies and it will encourage vaccination. You also have there as Maureen has mentioned states, like New York, that are building their own with a centralized database. I just got a notice from my doctor that my kids' vaccination records, all of them, immunization records, are going to be uploaded to the state unless I opt out. So given this lay of the land, do we think standardization is a good thing? Do we think a national database is a good thing? And what will do the most to encourage safety? So who wants to start?
I'm happy to jump in. Maybe the first thing I'll say is, boy, doesn't this really remind us how much we could use a federal data privacy law right now? Because just there's no common standard in the U.S. Maureen touched on this before, right? Like, right now there are different states with different laws that say completely opposite things on what you can and can't do in this space. And so I think if there's ever been any tipping point to push a federal data privacy law over the edge, then maybe this is it. We'll see what happens here over the course of the next few months. You drew the parallel, Jenny, to 9/11. I think the only thing I would point out, just in terms of how much the world has changed in the past 20 years, is just the concept of privacy being a fundamental human right, and how much that concept has developed over the course of the past three or 4 years with GDPR and now obviously just the prevalence of privacy legislation around the world. I feel like we are having privacy conversations even before COVID happened. We are having privacy conversations on a regular basis that just did not happen 10 or 15 years ago. And so I think just from a privacy standpoint, we're in a very different place from where we were at 9/11. So there's just a couple of perspectives from my side.
Anybody else want to jump in there? Maureen, one of the things that you must be seeing as far as an ERISA standpoint, is what's the responsibility when it comes to HIPAA? Is HIPAA enough to cover the acquisition of a vaccine status? From a digital passport perspective, and how does HIPAA fit in? And is what's there enough, or is something else needed?
I always think of HIPAA as the most frequently misspelled and misunderstood law in the history of privacy laws. But so I think that most people forget HIPAA only applies when health data is in the hands of a covered entity. So if it's not in the hands of a covered entity, HIPAA doesn't apply. So, and that's very few covered entities are very few types of people. And in the world of an employer context, it only means if you have a self-funded plan, which we do here, but so for larger companies that aren't insured on their medical plan, but then you're building up walls and you're keeping that data separate. So if we were to ever have some kind of a vaccine passport, we'd obviously need to make sure that the people who run the health plan aren't using that data. And I think most companies who have self-funded plans are pretty good at that. But I think it never ceases to amaze people that all this very sensitive health data that we might collect as a part of a fitness for duty evaluation before you go to work is not covered by HIPAA. So I'm always telling you, that's not either. That, like, I more frequently say, that's not covered by HIPAA. So the very few times that I do is important. And to me, it goes to what Eric said, like maybe this will actually push the country to get to a more unified federal privacy law as opposed to a sectoral approach, because HIPAA was passed to deal with an incredibly narrowly defined category of data, not just health data, which would be a small enough category, but health data only in the hands of certain people. And so, will we get to a place where it's just much easier as opposed to the horrific patchwork of not only, you have some for biometric and you have some for health, and then you have some states where there's another definition and there's no consistency around the definition of personal data. And so it makes it very challenging. And it would be easier in some senses if we were more like GDPR and had one definition for personal data, and then that's all the data that we want to make sure that we protect. So I very much like Eric, hope and actually think if there was ever the stars aligning, they have aligned about as much as anybody could hope for. And the states are passing crazy stuff to kind of push that needle even further to see if they can't turn up the heat to say, well, by 2023, if you can't figure it out, then we'll end up with something that looks like sick pay and data breach and everything else that has gone awry when you can't get the federal government to come up with something So my hope is that they do. I mean, I think HIPAA is not ready to deal with any of this, and there will honestly be more confusion than HIPAA will ever help. It will be covered by the states that have protections for health data, but those are all over the place too. So I don't think HIPAA will do a very good job of addressing it.
So Scott, same question when it comes to standardization. So even if there is a national privacy law, within the health community itself, within the vaccine community itself, there's, even if you think about the Euro Green, I think it is called, versus the Green Pass versus some of the conversations we're having in the United States, there's coverage questions. So like the European Pass covers data that is immunity general. So do you have immunity, not do you have the vaccine? So even within the vaccine space or the COVID space, there's a question of definition. So, you know, does standardization help, and technology standardization, and is anybody working on it?
Yeah, right at the beginning of this, we were on calls. I quickly got looped into the HL7 fire scene, and we're working on the existing framework for what they had for definitions out in the immunization space. And Jenny, you mentioned something about your own experiences with your child and the fact that there's state registries. So when it comes to, and Maureen, you mentioned sort of that separation of HIPAA entities versus non-HIPAA entities, and we can kind of look to, as a technologist, I look to the space. Okay, what scene currently has repositories of information? And I separate this word repository because your vaccination itself may exist as a digital record somewhere, and that somewhere may be bound by HIPAA, right? One would think that it originated in some format that you were working with a provider in a clinical state, and it was in fact from that scene. And somewhere, when you, the consumer, because there's not many other ways to do it, you pushed a button to challenge and take that and do something else with it and bring it into this other space where it can now be used by non-HIPAA entities. And we don't have a lot of control there because it's not regulated very well. But what we do have is the standards, the data standards that were originated in the health space. And so the non-health providers and opportunistic kind of entities and solutions that are out there, of course, are building their database to model against data that maybe had some benefit of practitioners in the health data space for a decade working on structuring this information in a way that makes it sound, and we can put use cases around it. So there's some benefit to standardization from a data standard that I think that's the easy one to check off. Is everybody using it? No. I mean, this space has moved so far and fast and furious that it's really hard to kind of capture everybody's interest in that way, just as not every technology provider in the health space that is in fact bound by HIPAA are using these data standards either. So we've got a lot of work still to do on the actual data side, but mostly it's right, once it's there, now because you use standards, you can connect and build compatibility or interoperability, as we say, between these databases. And so because it's so easy to move information around, great job, pat our technologists on the back, we made it very easy to do so. Now business comes in, and business needs standards on making sure that they know when and where it should be pulled for what purposes. So the actual pass on my phone, all the data may be baked into the QR code that sits on my device, which you can't see because of my background, but there you go. The QR code may in fact bake all the information into it. Some of the health declaration solutions just pack it on the phone, and that actually may be less secure. So it kind of brings up the conversation of security. And so our data folks and security folks are working hard on these networking concepts still, but there's so many challenges at the technical level of doing this. And then the technologists bump up against the privacy and the business folks. And we have not addressed or even brought up the conversation around equity on this panel yet. And so, whether I have a vaccination that can be put into that format, and I've been offered that vaccination, come into play. And then is that technology going to be readily available? Is the internet going to be wherever I'm required to present that QR code? All these things come into play. And working particularly for those government nations, we've tried to condition for those offline scenarios for those individuals that may have a reason to have an exception and not be presenting a pass, whether that's a reason that they weren't presented an option to get a vaccination, other comorbidities or health issues that may have prevented it, or simply a squeaky wheel situation where they bump up against a contingent of individuals that do push the privacy frame of mind so much that they're just looking for government exceptions to pass through border entry and get into a particular country for a vacation. So there's a lot to do still further, but I know I digress in answering the question specifically.
No, great answer. Actually, it's a great answer to kind of wrapping us up. I'm getting the high sign from our MC to start wrapping up. And I would say let's do a lightning round, 30 seconds. 1 year, 5 year, what do you see? And then I don't see any questions. So last question, 1 year, 5 year, what do you see for the use of vaccine passports?
I guess I'll start. I see 1 year, I see a lot more onboarding of these solutions, but a lack of consolidated approach on making sure there's some normalization and standard backing them. 5 year, I would hope to say that we've been able to find a way to shelf the concept where it's not particularly required for an emergency reaction to a pandemic, because we've kind of got past that. But there are now means to consider this a resilience option. It's an insurance policy that some of these tools can be brought on board. I'd love to see that happen. I don't know that it will, but I'd love to see that.
Maureen?
I mean, I totally echo everything that Scott said. And I think in the short run, I think we'll see a lot of craziness is unfortunately what we will see, and we will have to react to it, because I think there will be a lot of really great ideas that will be probably going at faster speeds than they should be to try to meet demand. And that's going to create some craziness for all of us. But so I expect in the short run to get all kinds of wacko designs and stuff that we all then run around and try to figure out, should we be doing that? Should we not be doing that? That's what I fear will be the short run. I think in the long run, I hope what Scott hopes. I hope that all of the craziness that will happen will start to come up with some really great use cases for things that maybe we're not even thinking of today for a lot of this technology, and better ways to store data, safer ways to store data, ways in which we can share data in ways that we don't today, and certainly more standardization across not only our own country, but other countries. But I think in the very short term, we're going to see it certainly in major international travel and some of the big things that we're seeing. But I actually don't think, at least initially, that most employers will require it. I think you're going to start to see a few more once Pfizer is no longer emergency use, because the risk profile goes down from a litigation standpoint, which is part of what employers think about. And I think as you have more lawsuits like what happened in Texas go that direction, I think that was a bad fact pattern. But as you continue to have fact patterns and people see, hey, it might be all right for us to do this, maybe you'll see a slight bit more. But I think most employers would rather not get into the business of doing this if we can avoid it. And unless we really see a reason to, I think we're going to try to stay away from it unless we really think there's a reason to. So I think in the short run, it's going to be everybody watching everybody to see what happens. And probably there are going to be a few doing some cutting edge things that might be a little out there, but I hope level out over the next couple of years.
So Eric, real fast.
I agree with everybody else. I'm usually an optimist, but in this case, I think countries and states have not proven ability to work together. So I think we're going to continue to see fragmentation in this market for a long time, unfortunately.
So Camille, back to you. I think an awesome panel. Thank you all very much for your perspectives. I know I've learned quite a bit about the state of play for vaccine passports and digital health in particular in different use contexts. So thank you all, and back to you, Camille.
Thank you. And again, thank you all. I've really enjoyed the session, and finally feel like I have a framework for thinking about such a wild time. So thanks to everyone for joining us on this vaccine passports conversation. And we hope you will also join us at the top of the hour for a conversation on national security, recent developments, emerging challenges, featuring Charlie Savage, Travis LeBlanc, Glenn Gerstle, and Robert Litt. Should be another terrific session, and hope to see you on the hour. Thank you.